Tudor, the hype brand for people with more money than most, but not enough to buy confidence. I like Tudor watches. I've owned several and I currently have one that I really enjoy, but I've never been into the Black Bay watches that much. They're kind of a bit too plain for me, not a lot to grab my attention, and too vintage inspired, again, for me. I want my watches to have kind of a more interesting personality, you know, to make up for the one that I have. I totally get the appeal though. The Black Bay watches are nice, and I would, and I probably have, recommended them to people who want to buy a luxury watch. And when Tudor announced this 37mm Black Bay 54 almost 2 years ago, I thought, fine, good, whatever. I'm glad people have smaller options in sport watches, but I just didn't care much. But some of you wouldn't and haven't shut up about this watch, and I noticed, and I listen. And so I got curious, and I asked the great people at Exquisite Timepieces if I could borrow a Black Bay 54 for a video. Because I knew Exquisite recently became an authorized Tudor dealer, and I knew I could take advantage of their work and their inventory to make another facile internet video, and here we are. Yes, you are in here with me. And I want to show you how the Black Bay 54 compares to the slightly larger, barely different Black Bay 58. And to do that, I borrowed a 58 from my friend Kara. Watch this Doc Mom on Instagram. Kara is great and has a fun collection. Fun collection. Some facts about the Black Bay 54, hereafter referred to as the BB54 or the Lil Buddy or Tiny B. The case is 37mm across, 46mm long, and 11.2mm thick. It has 20mm lugs, and the bracelet tapers from 20mm to 18. That's important. It has 200 meters of water resistance, and it weighs about 135 grams. The movement inside is the Tudor caliber MT5402, which is cost chronometer certified, and in this case is adjusted to -2 to +4 seconds per day. So what makes this watch so exciting to some people is the size, the 37mm diameter, and so let's talk about it. Due to overwhelming requests, I once again am employing the wrist and the delightful attached body of my wife, Dr. Mrs. Terrific. Lady friend has a wrist that's 5.75 inches in circumference. We'll say that's about 15 centimeters. I have a wrist circumference of 7 inches. That's about 18 centimeters. And I think seeing the BB54 on both of our wrists is pretty helpful, and I'm nothing if not helpful, and tired, always so tired. So here, look at the watch. It's gotta be one of the most watches I've ever seen. I think this works. I think this works on both of our wrists, and I think that's kind of a rare thing in watches for one size to work on both a 7-inch wrist and a wrist that's smaller than 6 inches. And yeah, I can see an argument for the BB54 being too small on my wrist, and I can see an argument for it being too big on my wife's wrist. But from a stylistic and comfort perspective, this watch is great, and I am very surprised. I was sure this thing would look and feel too small for me, but it ain't. The 46mm length might be part of that. You can find 46mm lengths on watches all the way up to 42mm in diameter. 46mm is not a short length for a watch, and that's part of why I think this works. Another reason is something that I called out earlier, the bracelet. It tapers from 20mm to 18mm. That means that this bracelet has the proportions similar to bracelets on 40mm watches. It wears and just looks a bit larger than many 37mm watches. But for better or worse, you have options with the Black Bay. How does the BB54 compare to the 39mm BB58? You wouldn't think that 2mm in size would make any difference. You know what? I forgot who my audience is. A normal person wouldn't think that 2mm would make any difference, but you, dear viewer, you know it really can. The 37mm BB54 versus the 39mm BB58. The 58 is also 2mm longer than the 54 and thicker than the 54 by about 1mm. But it has the same bracelet dimensions and it has almost the same weight. There's only about a 7% difference in the weight. And even though you can't see them, the movements are practically the same. It's the same movement. The 54 is just shrunk down a bit. But these two movements have the same 70-hour power reserve, the same architecture, and the same accuracy. Now let's compare the 54 to the 58 on my perfect 7-inch wrist. Seeing these side by side, I think the 58 is what most people my size would prefer, and I get it, I understand it. And I have a big but that I want to share with you in a few moments. And how about the two watches on Dr. Mrs. Terrific's elegant arm? To me, the 58 with its 48mm length, it just doesn't look as good. I mean, everything looks good on her, myself excluded, but between the 54 and the 58, it's gotta be the 54, right? At least that's what I think. But my wife lady is not so sure. She really likes how the larger watch looks on her wrist, and I'm not gonna debate her on that, or anything really. But you can already tell that the sizes aren't the only differences between the 54 and the 58. There's also an important difference when it comes to comfort. The BB54 has a T-fit adjustment system in the clasp. The length of the clasp can be adjusted without any tools. You just kind of pop it up and slide it. The standard BB58 that I have here doesn't have that T-fit system. It does have a few micro adjustment holes in the clasp, but those are not convenient. The BB54 clasp is better, it's that simple. And then there are a few stylistic differences, which are subtle but important to us. The case designs and the use of gold on the dial, that's mostly the same, but the dials themselves have different finishes. The 58 has a more matte texture, but the 54 has a very subtle sheen to it, a slight metallic finish. It gives off just a little more fancy. I wonder if Tudor did that in the expectation that this watch would be targeted a little more towards women than the 58. But the bezels are probably the most obvious differences, again, obvious to us at least. Both bezels have 60 clicks and both are kinda tough to get grips on. But then the grips themselves, the knurling, it's finer on the 58. The 58 has more of a coin edge style bezel. Then there's the printing on the bezel inserts. That's what really stands out to me. Different fonts, different numbers of markers, a red triangle versus a silver triangle, 12 o'clock. The 58's bezel insert has copper printing. I won't say gold or gilt. It's just kind of a light copper color. And then the 54's bezel insert just has silver markers and numerals. And between the two watches, on looks, I prefer the smaller watch, the Black Bay 54. And it really comes down to that bezel insert. It's simpler, it's cleaner, it's clearer to me. Now that subtle dial difference, I prefer the clearly matte finish of the 58, but overall, I like the 54's looks better. Now, how would I, or more importantly, how would you choose between these two watches? I fully understand that a lot of people, especially men, will just feel like the 37mm Black Bay 54 is too small for them. And this time I'm not gonna insult anyone for being scared of smaller watches or being terrified of people noticing that they have a small piece, timepiece. But, and here's the but I wanted to tell you about, I think that this small watch has more character and is more interesting because it's unexpected. Yeah, the 39mm Black Bay 58 is cool. I see them on people's wrists. It's a popular watch, and when I see them, I think, hey, that's great. But when I see a BB54 on someone's wrist, especially a wrist as large and as good looking as mine, I think, that dude, and yeah, it's usually a dude, that dude is a real one. That is a special look and a killer style. And in my opinion, and I know it's not a popular opinion, I think the BB58 on most wrists isn't all that interesting. It's kind of perfect, and perfect is boring. But a 37mm diver on a 7-inch wrist, that's kinda weird and vintage, and at least it's uncommon. And uncommon, for me, who's been exposed to more watches than sunshine, uncommon is what I like right now. I didn't expect to like this look right here, I didn't. But now that it's clear how much I like it, it makes sense to me. As much as anything in watch collecting makes sense.